Hi everyone, and thanks for coming. So this is the first in the series of 5 distinguished lectures that the School of Social Sciences has organized in the year 2018-2019. This year's theme is social change and social divisions in the neoliberal age. So after giving it a bit of thought, we decided that this was the best topic for us. We have become increasingly more aware of the importance of how the system influences not just everything in relation to ideologies, but also in a very concrete way on a micro level, things related to retrenchment of welfare programs, the changing nature of the labor market, an emergence of a new class system, a rise of new xenophobic attitudes, which could also be said to be related to the decline of the welfare state. So we've decided this is actually quite important. So with us today, Professor Peter Dwyer from the University of York. Peter teaches at the University of York, but he has taught before. He's held positions at the University of Leeds, the University of Salford, Nottingham-Trent, I think. Yeah. His main topic of research is welfare conditionality and social citizenship, but also forced labor and migration. Currently, he is the leader of a major ESRC project, which involves academics from 6 major academic institutions. And the project is called the Welfare Conditionality, Sanctions, Support and Behavior Change. The purpose of the study is not just to raise awareness amongst researchers and the public, but also to influence public policy. Peter will speak for about 40 minutes, and then we will have about 20 minutes to half an hour for questions. Okay, so thanks for coming, Peter.
Thank you. Thanks very much, and first of all, thanks for the invite. It's always a pleasure to get an invite somewhere. I don't think I've ever been called distinguished before, so that's the first. As Jasna said, I've got a long-standing interest in debates around social citizenship and welfare conditionality. And I lead the Welfare Conditionality Sanctions Support and Behaviour Change project, or WELCON for short. Now, we launched our main findings for the project in May this year, and we've had quite a lot of interest in them from various groups of people. What I want to do today, rather than just reiterate our main findings, is I want to sort of talk for about 30, maybe 40 minutes. I'll try and get through it in half an hour, because I think it's more interesting if we can have a conversation that way. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw on my sort of long-standing research interests, which are around the notion of social citizenship, issues around welfare rights and responsibilities, and particularly what's known as conditionality. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of do 2 major things. First of all, I want to argue with you and say that there has been a reconfiguration in what we mean by social citizenship. Now, I'm going to focus in on the UK case today, but for me, this reconfiguration of social citizenship and the stuff it's made of is a much more wider programme of change that affects states in and beyond Europe. There are different types of this reconfiguration, but something important has gone on. So I'm going to talk about welfare conditionality and the issue of discretion. And what I'm talking about really when I talk about the shift towards an increasingly conditional welfare state is a welfare state in which conduct, responsibility, individual behaviour of welfare recipients is to the fore, and the issues of need and issues of rights and entitlement have been marginalised. They've become secondary considerations. So I'm going to briefly discuss and define the interaction of welfare conditionality and this thing called discretion. And then what I want to do, because for me this is the interesting bit, because the project that I'm going to draw on is the welfare conditionality project, I'm going to present just 4 individual case studies from people who we interviewed 3 times over a 2-year period to explore how conditionality worked in their lives. Going to use these 4 cases to show how welfare conditionality and discretion come together and the impact it has on people's lives. what I want to do as well at the end is say a little bit about whether or not we can consider welfare conditionality a neoliberal project. Now, I'll say from the outset, I don't like that term. I like the term the new right, just because it works for me, yeah? But I was asked to say something about it, so I'm going to. And feel free to disagree with me. But basically the argument is what we've got now, and I'll be concluding with this, is that we've got a 21st century conditional welfare state that promotes social insecurity rather than social security, as we would perhaps hope a welfare state might want to do. Okay then, so a key aspect of my own work has been documenting the ongoing shift from welfare rights towards a more highly conditional system of benefits and services. And the central argument I'm making is that social citizenship has been reconfigured in the past 30 or 40 years. So first of all, we had social liberal, or what we might see as social democratic theorists like T.H. Marshall, Titmuss, etc., who were influential in setting out the scope and the vision of what we call the post-war welfare settlement. And their focus was very much on the substantive rights, the substantive social rights derived from common citizenship status rather than the responsibilities of citizenship. Now, this social democratic vision was about trying to ensure that publicly provided welfare would, to a degree, and only to a degree, not eradicate, but lessen inequalities and foster a sense of social solidarity between citizens who could call upon their rights of citizens in times of need. But over the past 3 decades, this has been fundamentally challenged by commentators on both the centre-right and the centre-left, I would argue, and these have been influenced by new right and new communitarian thinking. So although the focus today is on the UK, like I said at the beginning, this shift is not just about within the UK. I think we can see this kind of shift in many welfare states across the world, particularly, but not exclusively, in the Anglophone nations. So today, governments endorse welfare which prioritises responsible individual agency as a sort of panacea for a narrowly defined notion of welfare dependency. The welfare society of the past that promised, theoretically at least, a common citizenship status that guaranteed, at the very least, a minimum of universal welfare rights, today has been superseded by what Walters called the active society, in which increasingly individuals can only access social rights, social security, if they're willing to become workers in the paid labour market. As Walters says, many of the assumptions about the specifically social obligations and consequent rights of citizens no longer reply. The active society makes us all workers. Now, in this newly highly conditional social citizenship type of social citizenship, the focus is on individual rather than collective responsibilities. And it emphasises what's called a principle of reciprocity, an unequivocal link between rights and responsibilities. And policies that are seen to promote what we might see as largely unconditional entitlement to public welfare are seen as entrenching welfare dependency. So across mainstream politics in the UK, social citizenship has been reframed around this logic of individual responsibility and a principle of conditionality whereby the right to claim welfare is linked to specified prior contribution and responsible behaviour. Now, at the end I might say something about that, because I think this link between claim and contribution is part of the problem. And this idea of a link between claim and contribution is not a neoliberal project. It's central to the sort of Beveridgean vision of social insurance for everything. But Beveridge wasn't a fool. He knew that some people would not be able to contribute largely through paid work activity. That was his vision, and then make a claim on that basis. So underneath that, he had a social assistance system that was on the basis of defined need. Now, the idea is essentially that many of those on the right have argued what are seen as passive welfare rights, but I have a problem with that sort of phrase, but passive welfare rights are seen as part of the cause and not the solution to poverty. So the idea is essentially, from those on the new right and new communitarian critics, that what we've got is we've got some people who choose to live on welfare because they can do. Because if rights are largely unconditional and we don't make demands on people who are in receipt of social welfare benefits, some people will choose to live on public welfare. So what we've got to do is not get rid of the welfare state entirely, although people like Charles Murray argue that indeed is the solution. Other people like Lawrence Mead will say we've got to use welfare in an instrumental way to change the behaviour of this welfare-dependent underclass. And if they don't get with the programme and do as they're told and get involved in proactively seeking work, they don't get benefit. And for people like Mead, that's fine, because rights come with responsibilities. Now, I've argued elsewhere in a paper I did around 2008 that this isn't just about messing around with the sort of welfare state, little incremental shifts in eligibility criteria, etc., but using Hall's approach of paradigm shift. I've argued that the principle of conditionality is now a sort of a third order change, a significant change in the way that welfare is thought about by politicians, by members of the public, and it's the sort of prism or the lens through which we now look at welfare reform. And welfare conditionality, undoubtedly over the past 30 years in the UK, has been extended, intensified and personalised. Now I've got about 5 slides where I can show you all the policies that back up that claim. I'm not going to show them you. I've got them on the end if people are interested. But take it from me. Initially embraced by the sort of UK Conservative administrations of the late 1980s and 1990s, welfare conditionality was enthusiastically endorsed, embedded and expanded as a cornerstone of New Labour's third way welfare reforms. And subsequently, it's been further intensified, extended and personalised by the UK coalition government and its Conservative successors. It's been extended because today, groups of benefit recipients who were previously exempt from welfare conditionality, including many disabled people in receipt of employment and support allowance, lone parents with ever younger children, and even under universal credit, low-paid workers, people who are already working, and their partners, are now subject to benefit sanctions if they do not search for more and better paid work. It's been intensified because since October 2012, in preparation for the imminent introduction of universal credit, the government essentially launched an enhanced benefit sanction regime with tougher penalties for non-compliance. So for a first low-level offence, and a first low-level offence might be being 5 minutes late for your work-focused interview at the job centre, you can, and people do lose, 100% of their right to benefit for a 4-week period. And that reaches all the way up to, at the other end, if you commit what is known as a third, repeat high-level offence, such as refusing to take a job, you can be sanctioned for up to 3 years. Now, under universal credit, what's interesting, you can be sanctioned for low-level offences indefinitely until you comply. So really, what we're saying to people is, if you don't do as you're told, if you don't engage in work-related activities, we're going to suspend your right to benefits. Linked to this intensification is also an intensification of the work-related requirements that we demand of people who are on working age social security benefits. And people can now and are routinely required to undertake up to 35 hours of job search and look for a specified number of jobs. That might be 20 jobs a week, and prove that they have done this. If they don't do this, they will face the possibility of a benefit sanction. The other thing that I think is important is this is a personalised approach to conditionality these days. in the sense that work coaches, work programme staff are able to use their discretion to alter the mix of sanction and support that they use with individual benefit recipients as they see fit in many respects, obviously within certain broad rules. So moving on then, I've talked a lot about welfare conditionality, but what is it? And I think my colleagues, Suzanne Fitzpatrick and Beth Watt, sum it up nicely in their new book. The essence of welfare conditionality lies in requirements for people to behave in prescribed ways in order to access cash benefits or other welfare supports. More specifically, as it says on that slide there, in relation to social security systems, what welfare conditionality does is it links eligibility to continued receipt of benefit to claimants' mandatory engagement, mandatory, no choice, with work-focused interviews, training and support schemes and or job search requirements. It's certainly about realigning the relationship between collective benefits and support and individual conduct and behaviour. Those who advocate this approach, and I'm not one of them, I'll be quite frank with you, never have done, never seen why we've got a sanctions-based approach to supporting people into work, which is what many advocates would say. Advocates say that what you can do is you can use a mixture of sanction and support, of the stick and the carrot, to move people into work. But today it's not just about moving people into work. Under universal credit, it's about more, because under this thing that the Department for Work and Pensions like to call progression, if you are a low-paid worker and you're in receipt of the housing benefit or low-wage elements of universal credit, and you have got a job or several jobs, and you are what's below what's called the conditionality threshold in terms of the amount of money you earn, they can demand that you attend work-focused interviews. They can demand that you search for more work until you reach that threshold, and they can sanction you. I mean, we've got within the study a couple of examples of people who have been sanctioned for not attending a work-focused interview. Guess why? Because they were working. Yeah? Right? Where's the logic in that, this idea that we're going to enable people into work and we're going to basically sanction an element of their right to social security because they can't go to an interview because they're working? So it's certainly about carrots and sticks. Now, many of the critics of welfare conditionality have quite rightly focused on the negative, the profoundly negative impact of benefit sanctions. But some people will argue that you can use what we might see as coercive welfare to actually get people to engage and improve their lives, perhaps move into work, deal with irresponsible lifestyles, etc. If we drill down a little further, people like Paz Fuchs has talked about, when we talk about welfare conditionality, we can talk in vague or amorphous statements about the need to behave responsibly. But we can also talk about quite concrete, tightly specified conditionality, such as you will search for 35 hours a week and you will search for 18 jobs this week or 25 jobs or whatever, and if you don't, you're under threat of sanction. Now, what's also interesting about the conditional welfare state is this issue of discretion. And moving on to discretion, again, I think Watson Fitzpatrick's make an important distinction between eligibility and entitlement and say that these are not one and the same thing. Eligibility means that you may receive a benefit, whereas entitlement implies and means that you must receive it. They go on to state that discretionary forms of welfare are not a matter of right or entitlement, but instead distributed according to bureaucratically defined standards or norms and or the decision-making of individual officials. And then they quote this quote by Goodin here that says that discretion is an area of conduct which is generally governed by rules, but where the diktats of the ruled are indeterminate. In short, discretion refers negatively to a lacuna, a space in a system of rules. Now, discretion has long been part and parcel of welfare state provision. If you read some of Titmus's early stuff in the 1950s, he talks about the positive aspects of discretion, allowing street-level bureaucrats, the people who implement benefits and services on behalf of the welfare state, allowing them some leeway to use the rules proactively to enable people, to entitle people, etc. Lipsky has called this idea of street-level bureaucracy an important area for research, and there's an entire body that looks at the way in which people who administer benefits and implement them variously use their professional expertise, their personal judgments, their moral bias and prejudice to actually make decisions about the client who sat in front of them and whether or not, in some cases, they deserve a particular approach in relation to their access to welfare, or whether or not they should be denied welfare. So discretion is not an inherently good or bad thing. It very much depends on how it's exercised, and I hope to show you some of that in the examples later. Melander, who wrote a book in 2016 about discretion, which I think is quite useful, says the argument for discretion is based on the necessity of ensuring flexibility and adaptability to individual needs and circumstances. By contrast, the argument for reducing the latitude for discretion is that discretion can be abused and can lead to arbitrary decisions by welfare bureaucrats, and domination, So there's pros and cons in relation to this idea of discretion. He also goes on to say something of significant for discussion today, which is what's on that slide there, that one probable implication of increasing conditionality is more extensive use of discretion in welfare systems. And I think we can identify that within the sort of recent shifts in the universal credit system and the wider shift towards a conditional welfare state. Within the work programme, for example, which is now finished, but is being replaced by what's called the Work and Health Programme, advisors can use what's called a black box approach. They can mix and match sanction and support in order to work with an individual in relation to trying to get them into work. Under universal credit, job coaches, Job Centre Plus work coaches, have got increased discretion in the levels and types of conditions, and also the easements or flexibility that they can set in place within a personalised claimant commitment. Now, a claimant commitment is basically the agreement that is made between the client, the welfare service user, and the advisor about the conditions attached to their claim. Now, it's often presented as if this is some sort of nice chat where people sit down and discuss their needs, their care responsibilities, any impairments they might have, etc. And the advisor works with the person to tailor the conditionality to suit that particular circumstance. Now, it can work that way, and within the research we've done, there are a few examples of that occurring. But routinely, it is not seen by the people on the other side of the desk, the client, as a contract in any meaningful way. It's seen as a sort of illiberal, coercive contract because there is a huge imbalance of power. Many people sit on one side of the desk and just nod and say yes, 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 because if they say no, they are fearful they won't have any money. It's not a contract as anybody would define it in law because of this imbalance of power. Likewise with easements, the idea that somebody will sit down in a 10 to 20 minute discussion with somebody they don't know and then detail their impairments, the various illnesses, their personal relationships, etc. With them is often lacking because people don't always want to give this information. Now, you might say that, well, what is the DWP to do about that? Well, perhaps it's got to have better systems for the claimant commitment conversation, because politicians put great store on this as the way in which we can have flexibility and discretion to enable fair and decent claimant commitments. But as well as that, we also need to recognise that many of the people who are job coaches, advisors, have got massive caseloads, have got to shift people in and out in 10 minutes flat. This is not the place for this kind of personalised conversation that is often presented. Also, within Universal Credit, one of my PhD students, Helen Stinson, is just finishing a PhD, and she's just done a paper in an edited book I'm doing where she talks about the notion of vulnerability. And whereas before, under say JSA, etc., there used to be categorical definitions of vulnerability where easements or flexibilities were applied. So for example, if you were street homeless, they were said, well, we'll get rid of the conditionality for 2 weeks while you find somewhere to live. What Helen's arguing and showing is that categorical notions of vulnerability have been eroded and discretion is very much to the fore. This is what she says: an erosion within benefit policy of traditional ideas that particular claimant groups will automatically require additional forms of support. Instead, the notion of vulnerability is replaced by a vague reference to individuals who have complex needs or who require additional support to access benefits. She argues that, therefore, any support offered is intended to be temporary and temporarily mediate the impact of the mainstream system, but it is itself conditional upon universal credit recipients being willing and able to overcome their vulnerable circumstances. So, for example, she's got some people she's interviewed who've applied for an emergency loan because they can't manage, and they've been refused an emergency loan by their job coach, their universal credit advisor, because they say, well, you can't afford to pay it back. And the reason you can't afford to pay it back is because you're not working, so you need to get a job. Yeah? This idea that in many ways the solution to this entrenched poverty that is part and parcel of the current UK social security system, mainly because of inadequate benefit levels, the solution is for you to get off your backside and go and find yourself a job. So any additional support is often at the discretion of the job coach. Right, this is going to be very quick. I'm going to tell you about the project. This project was 2013 to 18. We were interested in the ethics and the efficacy of welfare conditionality. In short, is it fair? And does it work? How does it work? What we did was, it was a huge qualitative project. There were 3 sets of types of field work, but at the heart of it was this 3 rounds of what's called a repeat qualitative longitudinal panel study with a diversity of welfare recipients subject to conditional welfare interventions. Yeah? Which basically means we went out there and we interviewed people 3 times over a 2-year period. Month 0, month 12, month 24, and we looked at how this stuff worked out in their lives alongside everything else that was going on. It's one of the biggest studies of its kind undertaken, to my knowledge, and it took a lot of doing. 1,082 interviews we did in the end, and we did them with these groups. We were interested in social security, but we were also interested in the way conditionality cuts across other areas of policy in relation to migration, offending, etc. So we interviewed approximately 60 of these month 0 and carried on interviewing them over a broadly 2-year period. We did this work in England and Scotland because we wanted a comparative dimension because of the way in which the legislation and jurisdictions in Scotland in certain areas are different from England. We didn't do Wales and Northern Ireland because we had plenty going on already, and it would have increased the level of complexity, I believe, to the point where we couldn't do it because it was quite an ask. We did it in these locations. You will see that Bath, Inverness, Warrington are on there. They were added because they were initially pilot areas for the universal credit rollout. And when we developed this project, universal credit didn't exist. It wasn't on the books. So we needed to talk to those people. So what I'm going to do now is the interesting bit. How long have I got left? 10 minutes. Right, we're going to rattle through this. This is the interesting bit, right? What I want to do is I want to show you how welfare conditionality come together with 4 case studies, right? This woman I've called Joy. I called her Joy on purpose because when I'm wading through 1,082 interviews with other people, yeah, there's a lot of despair in there. This is actually a case where the use of sort of discretionary powers by a work programme provider actually enabled this woman into work. I'm not going to read the slide, I'm going to tell you about this woman while you read the data yourself. Joy was a refugee. She came to the UK about 5 years ago. She got a successful asylum claim, became a refugee, quickly found employment by herself, but then got made redundant. Didn't know what to do, so she went to sign on. She signs on. She speaks better English than I do. She comes from an English-speaking nation. I've read the transcripts. This woman can speak English. But she was sent on a basic English course and a basic maths course. And when she said why, she was told, because you're going, and if you don't go, you get sanctioned. She's not daft. She went, yeah? She goes back after 6 months of doing these courses, and the bloke says to her again, right, you're going on another course. And she thought, oh, God, here we go again, fobbing me off, yeah? But she got sent to a work programme provider. She went in, the guy sat her down and said to her, let's have a look at your CV. So she pulls out a 2-page CV. And he goes, that's not very good, is it? She goes, oh, I've got another one. I've got a proper one. But they told me not to use that when I went on this course, yeah? Joy's interesting. She could speak English, she had a lot of social capital, she was very employable. So guess what this work programme provider, this advisor did? He sat down and he connected her to appropriate interviews and she got a job. And look what happened at Wave B. She went for a few interviews, she got a job. Wave C, she's still in work, she's been promoted, she's passed probation, she's not living it large, but she's earning money, she's paying her rent, she's happy. That is an atypical case. It is very rare. In the 339 people who we managed to interview on more than one occasion, we've yet to find more than a handful, yeah? But what happened was this guy did his job and thought my job's to get her in work, yeah? Used his powers, that space that was created, to enable her into work. Couple of points to note. It's the employment-focused support, as it says at the bottom of the slide, and not the sanction that changed the situation. But she didn't need behaviour change. Like many people in our sample, they wanted to work, and she was helped into work because this man used the discretionary space available to help her into work. Let's go to the other end of the spectrum. And again, this is a particularly bad case, but it's not the only one. Yeah, and many people fell into this kind of situation. This bloke's interesting. He's got a history of homelessness, but he's been on income support. Don't know why he was on income support, can't work it out. One of them great, unfathomable things. He's living in social rented housing. He's been there for several years, and he's living on benefit, yeah? He's got depression, he's got other illnesses, yeah? What happens is, essentially, he got sanctioned. He got sanctioned for non-compliance. He then went into rent arrears and he got made homeless. So we interview him year one, he's homeless in a homelessness centre. Basically, we couldn't get him at Wave B because he disappeared. But we got him at Wave C, we got him a second time 2 years later. He was still homeless. He'd had a little period where he got into supported housing and come out for various reasons. He's destitute. He's been destitute for 2 years, and he survives by going to homeless charities, etc., as it says there. He doesn't claim benefits anymore. He doesn't want to because of the hassle that it does his head in, as he says, yeah? Now, for some people, that's a success story. He's off welfare, but he's into destitution. It's not the only example we've got. Not much discretion there. The second time we interviewed him, it was in the middle of a 6-month sanction because he'd gone to the work programme because they said, if you come back, we might let you back in and give you some benefit. But he missed appointments again because, as he put it, I was too busy looking for somewhere to sleep and something to eat. Yeah? Interesting case. This one, I like this one because I interviewed this man 3 times. And John is interesting because John's a kind of man who is about my age, late 50s. When I first met him, he'd been street homeless. As it says there, he got made redundant. He started taking hard drugs. He started selling hard drugs. It was quite exciting and it snowballed. In the end, he lost his family home, his business, his family, and he's on the street. Now, what was interesting was he went to the job centre. And look at that second quote, just 2 lines down. The advisor was absolutely fantastic. He'd got us to the point where he'd had enough. He'd got himself in a recovery programme. He was being supported by an homelessness organisation and he was moving forward with his life. He wasn't on my case. He was encouraging, brilliant. He hasn't just let me get away with it. It's been, what about this training course, what about that? But he knew he was homeless and he had a plan, yeah? And what happened in Wave B? John had got in with the homelessness organisation, had got a competitive apprenticeship type job. They basically saved his life, yeah? They turned his life around. The support, the non-conditional support, nothing to do with the social security system, in combination with an advisor at the job centre who used some flexibility, gave this man space. Look at the bottom bit, because at the 3rd interview, I revisited a sanction he'd mentioned in the first interview, and it became really apparent what had gone on. He'd gone to the job centre. You can't go into a job centre now outside your allocated slot. So he'd got there, he'd gone upstairs, a security guard had gone, you're too early, get downstairs. So they knew we were there. Because he didn't want sanctioning. He's not daft, he needs the money. He's still homeless, yeah? So what he does, he goes downstairs, they let him back up, he sits down, he sits there for 20 minutes, nobody comes, he sits there for half an hour, nobody comes, then a woman comes up and goes, where have you been? Because I've been sat here for half an hour. No, you haven't, I'm going to sanction you. I'm going to recommend you for a sanction. So he goes, no, you're not. I've been here. So she says, right, I'm getting security, I'm getting the police. On your back. He says, no, get who you want. I'm sitting here and I am not moving. Manager comes, explains the situation asked the security guard. Security guard said he was here, he's been here, he was here early, etc. Manager pulls him to one side and says, because the sanction's been applied now, which you hadn't, you recommend the sanction, but because we've recommended it, it's got to stand. It doesn't have to stand. When I told that some people in the DWP in London, they went, it shouldn't happen like that. We all know it shouldn't happen like that. It does. So what John did, because he had a plan and a focus, he went back to the soup kitchens and he lived through homelessness charities for a 4-week period. Other people might have gone back to a life of crime and drugs. But it's interesting. The reason that woman sanctioned him was because the other bloke wasn't there. He was on holiday. So, interesting that discretion can work positively, but we can see some different things. 5 minutes, great. That should be just about enough time. Now then, the last one, in-work conditionality. As I mentioned before, in-work conditionality is very interesting because you can be a low-paid worker now in receipt of various elements of universal credit. Universal credit combines 6 means-tested benefits into 1 monthly payment, and these can be out-of-work benefits or in-work benefits, low-wage supplements, housing benefit components. Now, Joan's interesting. She's a cleaner. First interview, she's got 3 jobs. She's got 3 little contracts, and she's got this woman who's a job centre advisor who says, well, I think you need to look for a bit more work, Joan. She's aware she's got arthritis, she's aware she's got depression, and she sort of encourages her to try and get some work. She's more like a friend, really, as it says there. Similar age to me. It's so nice, yeah? Wave B, it ain't nice. There's another woman, because the first advisor's moved on. There's no discretion being exercised here. She's saying, I'm going to sanction you if you don't keep looking for more work. She didn't sanction me, but it was a warning of a sanction. She spoke down to me like I was a child. Because I've been all over the show with it. I've not stopped work, I'm still working. She said to me I'm supposed to do 40 hours. She's not supposed to do 40 hours. That might be an error on Joan's side or the advisor's side, 35 hours. What's interesting about Joan is, Joan was hassled between B and C. She was at the end of a tether. She was on medication for mental health issues. She was still working. And this woman's telling her she has to do a job that overlaps with another job and apply for this job, otherwise she'll face a sanction. Now, Joan has had, right the way across the 2 years, between 3 and 5 jobs. Now, yes, Joan's hours have gone up from about 24 hours a week to 34 hours a week at Wave C. So I could claim that we've got progression here, yeah? She's got another 10 hours of work, yeah? Interestingly enough, she told us in the final interview she's about to lose one of the contracts and it'll come down to 20 odd again. Joan doesn't want to work full time. Joan is 60. Joan says, my sister gets her pension, I don't. I don't want to work, I want to work part time. But she's got to keep doing job search, work focused interviews, etc., because she needs the housing benefit element to help her pay her rent. She lives in social housing with her son. Now, my question is that what we should be doing? Is that what a welfare state should be doing? Essentially, bullying a 60-year-old woman who is at the fag end of the paid labour market, who actually goes out and actively seeks new contracts because she's told us about it, but she's being told she's got to do it, do more, do more, do more, at great cost to herself. Is that the kind of social security system we want? So, 2 more things and I'm finished. I won't be long yet. Is this neoliberal? There's a definition of neoliberalism, yeah? I don't like the term neoliberalism, as I said. I prefer the new right because that was the term when I was doing my PhD about 20 years ago. And I think the new right's a better term because that definition up above talks about free market economics, a smaller state, etc. But the new right is very much about free market economics and a residual, conditional and authoritarian welfare state, a small, mean welfare state, a highly conditional and paternalistic one that says it is right to interfere into your personal life, to make you search for work, because ultimately it will do you good in the long run. It didn't do many of the people who were on our study that much good, I can assure you. What we get here from the sort of new rights is a heady mix of money. We can save money, we can have a shrunken welfare state, and morals. People should behave this way in order to access welfare benefits. That has great populist appeal for politicians and also certain sections of the public. We can blame those who do least well out of the sort of capitalist market system. We can blame them for their situation. Joan can't help the fact that much of the paid labour market in the sector in which she's working is organised on short-term, flexible, even zero-hour contracts. She can't do anything about that, but she's expected to progress within work. So in many ways, yeah, perhaps it is to do with neoliberalism, but not necessarily. There is plenty of welfare conditionality in the Scandinavian welfare states, which, as Ben Anderson tells us, are meant to be universalistic, more generous, etc. We can also see that a conditionality consensus existed across mainstream political parties, right across the left-right divide, I would argue, up until about 2 or 3 years ago. I'll say a bit about that later if you want. So, conclusions. Welfare conditionality does not work as advocates say it does. The evidence is in here, the study that we've done, and it is elsewhere. It's hugely ineffective in facilitating entry into or progression into the paid labour market. The most common outcome amongst the people we interviewed over time was no change at all. We spend a lot of money, we cause a lot of pain, but nothing fundamental changes. Benefit sanctions bring about profoundly negative personal, financial, emotional, health outcomes. They do nothing to enhance people's motivation to prepare for, seek or enter paid work. They are punitive and ineffective. Much of the mandatory support that you've got to go on is of poor quality and too generic. And for a substantial minority of welfare of claimants, welfare conditionality initiates and sustains a range of negative outcomes, including, importantly, counterproductive compliance. People become so obsessed with meeting the conditions of their claim that it gets in the way of meaningful work search. And not because they think, sod it, I'll play the game. Some of them do, we met a few. But most people are so scared of losing money that they make sure they apply for 28 jobs, they do as they're told, they do whatever they have to do, and they don't look for work. Some people, particularly vulnerable people, disengage from the social security system. What this does is it increases poverty, movements into paid work, movements into survival crime, and even destitution, exacerbated ill health, etc. Increased discretion within the conditional welfare state is also highly problematic. And I'm going to read this bit out because I wrote it this morning. I can't remember it. Right, so this is what I'm saying. Increasing discretionary powers within UC is highly problematic, especially because of the altered context in which street-level bureaucrats operate. Welfare conditionality is now the context in which they're exercising discretion. They're often under, as I said, incredible time and resource power and working in a system where their role is now to monitor compliance and recommend sanction, not enable people into work. The emergence and consolidation of the conditional welfare state has eroded the potential identified by people like T.H. Marshall, 1950, Espin Anderson, 1990, of decommodified social rights. Rights granted on the basis of citizenship status rather than performance. Social citizenship today is not about delivering an entitlement to even a basic modicum of welfare on the basis of citizenship status. Eligibility to welfare is now reserved only for those who accept particular state prescribed responsibilities and participate in often extensive work-related outcomes. Peter Taylor Gooby summed this up succinctly a while back when he said, citizenship today is not about what you get anymore, but it's about what you do. If you don't believe me, read the evidence. My question to you, is this the kind of welfare system we want? I don't want this. I don't want this for me, my kids, or anybody else. Yeah? And I think we can change it. And I'll finish on that note. Sorry for rambling on a bit. Yeah.
Thank you, Peter.
We're ready for questions now. We have about 25 minutes. John, that was quick.
Well, thank you for that excellent talk, Peter. I've got a very simple question, really. The work you're presenting and what of us in this field try to present, so, like I say, is this the kind of welfare system we want? Does the government really give a damn? Don't they really want it to be horrible? Like Lawrence Mead argued, like I've heard people from the Centre for Social Justice argue, they want it to be horrible. They don't care whether it works or not in terms of important outcomes.
It's a very interesting question, and I'm going to give him a break. Yeah, I'm going to give Lawrence Mead a break because I've met him and talked to him. Yeah, he's a very civilised man on one level. His ideas I profoundly disagree with. But for Lawrence Mead, it is not good enough that a welfare system that's conditional, which he supports and has driven for years, pushes people into destitution. For him, they've got to be pushed into the paid labour market. And I think people like Ian Duncan Smith are quite sincere in their views that welfare conditionality should be about enabling people into work in their understanding, yeah? I profoundly disagree with their analysis and their approach, but I think that they honestly believe that they're doing something of worth. Why they won't listen to the evidence is because I would suggest they've, what's the word? They've invested so much time and energy in this project that to suddenly say, no, I was wrong, we are wrong, we're going to get rid of the conditionality in universal credit, we're going to get rid of conditionality as it now stands, they won't do it because of, you know, it's about political will. And political parties, you know, think that some of this plays well with the general public. And some of it does play well with certain sectors of the general public. Why should we support these idle so-and-sos? They will listen to things around the edges, but in principle, I don't think many of them do. Having said that, the conditionality consensus is starting to be unpicked. The Labour Party is talking about getting rid of sanctions, is exploring these issues. The Scottish National Party is talking about it in Westminster. When we go and present our findings to the Scottish Government or the Welsh Government, and we talk to their civil servants, you get a different response. But sanctioning policy remains reserved at the UK level. Does that help?
Thank you. Anyone else?
Is there a mic around?
Just, yeah, there's a comment. I'll just run away. Yeah. She could have got that close one. She chose it. Oh.
You've got to be democratic.
Thanks very much for your presentation. It was very informative. I don't allow the government to feign ignorance actually because that gives them a get out. And if I could quote Ken Loach, he said it's conscious, calculated cruelty, the 3 C's, and that's what it is. Because when you come up, and everything is policy-based, it's not evidence-based, because if you work on evidence-based, we wouldn't have universal credit.
No.
And when Esther McVeigh says, yes, some people will unfortunately be affected, if people are affected, it doesn't work, even if it's one person. So I don't allow them any get-out clauses. And under Esther McVeigh and Ian Duncan Smith, at least 120,000 people have died since 2010 because of sanctions, because of tests at Atos, where people were forced into work and died before they started the jobs or a week after they started. So when I look at this government, everything they do is done with precision, it's intended, and no, they don't care.
I agree with you about everything you've said about the negative aspects of it. I don't want you to take my last answer to John that I allow them to feign ignorance. I do not. I was just saying that they hold their views, and I think they hold them for what they think are good reasons. They are wrong, profoundly wrong. They do ignore the evidence. I agree with you. And we don't want them to get any get-out clauses. I agree with you. I don't think they work with precision, yeah? If they worked with precision, yeah, universal credit would not be the God Almighty cock-up it is now, right? The principles underpinning it are flawed, and they should have seen that before they even brought it in. I agree with you that they keep driving coaching horses through evidence that says this stuff harms people, yeah? And I would wholeheartedly support that. But I think some of it is more to do with saving political face than precision, yeah? The project, I think, may start to face some issues, particularly when in-work universal credit rolls out nationally. That's why they've stalled it. Disabled people and employment support allowance, basically, it shouldn't be anywhere near incapacity benefit policy, this stuff. End of story. And that's what we say in the findings.
Can I just give clarification to the precision I was talking about? It's done with such precision to detrimentalise to the hills. I should have given some
That's fine. I think we agree with each other. But it's just points of clarification.
Thanks for that. Next question, Mike.
Thanks, Peter. I just want to go back to the third case study for a minute, because you seem to be suggesting that there's some discretion on the part of job centre staff. And I just wondered whether, even if informally, as part of your research, you had a chance to speak to job centre staff, and whether you were able to discover the kinds of pressures that they're under, in terms of, is there a culture of targets and things like that? I don't know whether you can throw any light on that.
The short answer is no, and I'll tell you why. The DWP refused to allow them to take part in the focus group interviews. The idea of the focus group interviews was that we would go out and talk to street level bureaucrats, both those who advocate on behalf of benefit recipients, benefits rights advisors, etc., housing associations. We got loads of them, but we tried repeatedly to get focus groups with Job Centre Plus coaches, work programme advisors, people who might be involved in the work capability assessment process. But basically, after 12 months of trying and being very nice about it, I got a letter saying no. And there was nothing we could do about it. I was angry. I mentioned it in a House of Commons presentation I was doing under Chatham House rules, which I wrongly understood as it doesn't leave the room. It did leave the room because I got a phone call off the Guardian the next day saying, "What's all this?" And I just said to Janice, our press officer, "Just kill it, will you? We can't coerce anybody to engage in research." But it is hugely problematic that the DWP did not want to engage in an independent academic study. I don't know why not. Several work programme providers were willing to talk to us and let us do focus groups. I got replies to the letters I wrote to their chief executives. So we couldn't get that into the project, and we wanted it in there. We had a series of vignettes that we used in the focus groups to see how people would react to certain situations, to explore precisely the discretion that we wanted to sort of tease out, but we weren't able to, and it still irks me till today. But my job was then not to have a massive battle with the DWP in public, because we were in the middle of the field work, and that might have complicated getting access to some of the people that we were talking to. Is that okay?
Do you think it has cyclical element in the next snap general election? Will they change their perspective?
In the next general election, good question. One thing I don't normally engage in is crystal ball gazing, because nothing surprises me in politics these days. You know, we voted to leave the European Union. I think that in the next general election, Brexit will dominate all things, as it has done. Much policy, social policy, welfare policy has been marginalised. Lots of policy has been marginalised while we sort that one out. I think that there will certainly be a difference between the mainstream political parties on it, but as far as I'm aware, the Labour Party has not said they're going to get rid of it yet, universal credit yet. They've made hints, but we await their policy statements. It could have an impact, I hope it does, because it might influence the way some people vote. Is that okay? Thank you.
It's a simple question, really. I just wanted to ask you where universal basic income might fit into all this. So something where it's provided as a right because of your citizenship. How would that work out in relation to the things you've been talking about?
I think it would solve many of these problems, yeah. I don't think it's going to happen. I'm a cynic. You know, I've been looking at this stuff now for 25 years, since I was 30 years old. Universal basic income is a great idea, but we'll need such a fundamental overhaul of the tax and benefit system, and I don't just mean social welfare benefit, but fiscal occupational benefit system. I think that we're a long way off it. The other thing I will say is I saw, is he called Van Paris? I can never say his name right, who's an advocate of, one of the first advocates of universal basic income, at a conference in Sweden a couple of years back. And it was interesting. Universal basic income was reserved for citizens, so it wasn't that universal. It was universal in the sense that citizenship is a limited form of universality. But for example, if you are a migrant without papers, you ain't getting no UBI, so it solves some problems, but not everybody's. In principle, I support it. In practice, I don't think it's going to happen. And I don't say that with any great joy, because, you know, we're not promising the earth through universal basic income. We're promising a minimum amount that every citizen should be able to access as of a right. And I think that's what a social security system should be about.
Question that goes back to last but one question about quotas and about members of staff, the flexibility they have to be discretionary, and whether a certain amount of quotas are put on upon members of staff. I wondered what work you'd been able to do with the relevant union, which is PCS, and see if you could approach it that way, or if you were able to talk to the union itself to get the staff side of it from that perspective.
We have got in the key informant interviews several representatives of organised labour. I'm not going to say anything more than that because it might undermine their anonymity. Yeah. So we have got the sort of trade union perspective in there in the KI stuff. There is space for some discretion within the system. So, for example, we've got some examples where someone was 5 minutes late and said, I'm not going to sanction you this time, but if you do it again, you know, I understand you were late for the bus. On the other side, we've got a woman who was sanctioned for missing a work-focused interview after she'd phoned up to tell them she was going to her brother's funeral and she couldn't make the meeting, and was told that's fine, don't worry about it, when you come back we'll sort it. She came back, she got sanctioned, she appealed, it was upheld. We've got another person, a positive use of discretion, where someone on a work programme provider, one of the few, we managed to sneak into a focus group before the curtain came down on us, who said, you know, who had some interesting things to say about, well, I knew that Fred was struggling because he's got issues with his mental health, and I knew that the reason he hadn't come to the work programme was, so I phoned him up. I said, well, Fred, why aren't you here? I've got to recommend you back for a sanction to the job centre for non-attendance. And he said, I'm not well. So what she did is she ignored it, the fact that Fred wasn't there for that day, and she said, but do come in tomorrow. So there is space, that lacuna is there, but it's very hard for people within the system at the moment, which in many ways is almost automated in relation to sanctions, to make that space, I suppose, without breaking the terms of their contract with the DWP. Does that help? Thank you.
Thank you, Rich.
Thanks very much for a really interesting talk. I wanted to pick up on this, you briefly mentioned mental health there, and I wanted to pick up on that a little bit. I mean, I think that, as you rightly say, and I completely agree with you, that the idea that conditionality is supplied, well, I think perhaps in general, particularly to disabled people, and people with mental distress within that kind of category of disabled people as well, is extremely concerning. But actually the direction of travel for the government now, with the 5-year forward view for mental health, the notion of employment as a health outcome is very prominent in that document. So what we're seeing is an extension, if you like, of this kind of conditionality beyond the welfare policy field and into the mental health and health policy field, which I think is a deeply, deeply concerning development. And I think that one of the arguments that we can make around that, challenge that. I mean, actually, just to say, as a reflection of that, what I'm hearing is that the access to people who are using mental health services, NHS mental health services, and I used to work in that setting myself, is that people are having less access to welfare rights support than before, and actually there are kind of roles like engagement in workers, I'm hearing, is a development. So there's more emphasis on getting people into work than there is supporting people to access their welfare rights. So I think this is very much a kind of concerning development. I think we also need to recognise that, you know, I think it's useful this phrase that you know, mental distress is the industrial injury of the 21st century. That actually this is focused on the idea that work is good for mental health. Actually, you know, much work is not good for mental health. Actually, work can be the reason that people come into mental health services, problems at work, insecure work, bullying at work, and so on. So I just wondered if you could kind of comment a little bit on that kind of aspect of it. Also, could I just have a very quick question? I wondered if you have any thoughts. We mentioned UBI, but any thoughts on what does a socially just welfare system look like? So what kind of demands should we be making for change in the system?
Okay. First of all, on mental health, I'm actually writing a paper where we've looked at mental health across the 481 people. Because although we sampled a disabled people's group, some of whom purposely sampled people with mental health, issues of mental health, mental impairment were cut across the sample hugely. In relation to mental health, I mean, does it take a genius to work out that if you put pressure on people with stress-related illness, anxiety, depression, bipolar, etc., because it's all in there, if you put pressure on people, that they get worse? It doesn't take a genius to work that one out. So, like I said before, my view is that this stuff has no place in incapacity benefit policy. I don't think it has any great place in social security policy. But how the hell a new Labour government bought in employment and support allowance on the back of this, identifying a work-shy number of people who weren't really ill, is beyond me, yeah, and really incenses me, yeah. The issue about mental health is important because mental health is often episodic, yeah, and that feeds through to the work capability assessment, feeds through to your ability to engage in paid work, etc. I think one of the key things for me is, one of the key positive things is that even some advocates of welfare conditionality in other settings are now starting to say, look at the disability gap, both physical and mental health. The evidence says it doesn't work. This makes people worse and it pushes them further away. Let's get rid of conditionality for disability claimants. People like Matthew Oakley, for example, who supports the principle of conditionality, has said it's gone too far with groups like that. So in relation to mental health, yeah, I can only endorse what you're saying. I mean, the evidence, I'm trying to write several papers and a book at the minute, and it's about ordering it right so it has the best, I don't mean impact in the ref sense, but it tells the story properly, yeah? In relation to what a socially just system might look like, well, I didn't see anything wrong with requiring people to sign on once a fortnight and say they were actively looking for work, yeah? What you do then is, you get rid of the compulsion and the fear, and you get them through the door and you start to work with them to meet their requirements to try and get them into work. Now, for some people who are close to the paid labour market, that might be the kind of stuff that Joy got, getting her directed to job interviews. For other people with various vulnerabilities, etc., it's about providing therapies, support on a voluntary basis to get them to try and engage with their problems. They are their problems often, yeah, but they are ours as well. And it's not about saying it's down to you this, it's about supporting people to move forward in their life. Because people who are homeless, who've got drink and drug addiction issues, who've got mental health problems, who've got all sorts of background stuff going on, like many of us have, yeah, do not respond to a stick. They need supporting into work. Where they cannot work, and nor should they be expected to work if they are ill and impaired, then we should support them through the right to social security benefit. Yeah, not enable them into work. Where people want help to go into work, help them. If people have good reason why they're not engaged in the paid labour market and don't think they can, let's give them some money as a modicum of social citizenship to try and support them. Because we forgot that. The right to welfare is just as important as the right to work. And you know, it varies for a number of us over our lifetime. It's not us and them, it's us, yeah? But depending on where we are in the hierarchy of occupation and paid labour markets, we have very different experiences. When I was seriously ill in the middle of this project, I'm a professor at an established university. My wages get paid in full for 6 months, yeah? I don't have to worry about paying the mortgage or feeding people. Occupational welfare, yeah? Different for me. Let's recognise that those at the bottom end of the paid labour market or people who are in receipt of benefit need support.
Okay. We have time for one last question. I was going to make two.
Well, I'll try. Do I have to press this? No. My first question is, because we know that apart from everything else, it's universal credit will be a bureaucratic mess. The DWP is now outsourcing a lot of advice to, or a lot of help to the Citizens Advice Bureau. I found that quite a worrying idea, because I also understand that they then sign a contract not to criticise. So it seems to me that both directly and indirectly, the voices of the advice agencies and charities, which have been quite strong in their criticism, are being, I think the word is co-opted.
Yes.
And I found that really worrying. On the movement towards a system based on discretion, I do think there's been a move in a kind of Overton window in that area. For instance, in relation to bedroom tax decisions, at the Supreme Court level, the decision was, yes, this is a really bad thing, and disabled people do have a right to the room that they need. However, this can be dealt with through discretion.
Yeah.
And similarly, if you ask in certain circumstances, what's these people to do? The official government of this country says, charity, food bank.
Yeah.
Just before, there was one last person to the hand up. Can we take that?
So you've identified a lot of issues in the welfare system. Do you think also there's a lot of issues in the jobs themselves, like the low paid jobs, 0 hour contract, and that people are like torn between two things?
Yeah, I can make a comment about that if you wish, yeah. I'll start with this lady's questions first, just while I remember them. Yeah, I saw that. I was reading the paper, I think, on Sunday when it said, if you sign up for this, you're not got to criticise Esther McVeigh. Well, what are politicians for if not to criticise? Doesn't that come with the territory, yeah? But it's a serious point, because this symbiotic relationship between advice agency and the sort of the DWP, it's a bit like that inside the whale argument George Orwell talks about, yeah? And we've seen it before with things like the Refugee Council and Refugee Action getting involved in supporting asylum seekers through Home Office contracts. I don't envy the Citizens Advice Bureau their job. Their view is probably, if we don't do this and we can negotiate the best routes through this system for vulnerable people, some great big multinational like A4E will do it. Yeah, so I think they're caught between a sort of rock and a hard place. In relation to you can deal with it with discretion. I think you're speaking to the point I was trying to make at the end. We can't rely on discretion because it's the wider context in which discretion is being applied. You know, the idea that you've got a spare room, the spare room subsidy, that's the overarching framework that we, the taxpayer, should not be subsidising them, the welfare dependent, to have the life of Riley and a spare room, yeah? So, yeah. Sorry, I'm using their language now. Or you know, the partner or the carer, whoever. But that's the problem with discretion is it is discretion, and that space can be exercised positively or negatively. Yeah. So it's no answer. Your point about contracts is very interesting. One of the women we spoke to, lots of people on universal credit were on 0-hour contracts or short-term contracts, whereby somebody worked, for example, as a builder in Scotland. And do you know what he does in winter when the ground freezes? He signs on, and then he goes to work again when it thaws out, yeah? Now, the thing about the labour market is, and universal credit, and there's a paper I'm doing with Sharon Wright at the minute, where we're talking about conditionality mismatches. And what we're saying is, you've got a universal credit system that is built around a full-time 35-hour week model, yeah? You've got to search for work for 35 hours a week, yeah? That doesn't reflect the reality of the labour market in which most people on means-tested universal credit will be working, because they will be working on flexible 0-hour contracts. One woman said to us, for example, I don't know if I'm working tomorrow, never mind next week. They phone me up when they want me. So how can I go and get another job with another couple of employers, as you're telling me to do, because the first employer wants me to be totally flexible. So there's rigidity within the sort of universal credit system that doesn't reflect the flexibility and reality that employers demand at the bottom end of the paid labour market. And many employers do not like the welfare system interfering with their flexible workers' ability to be flexible and come at their beck and call.
Thank you so much, Peter. That was most inspiring. So the findings of the project can be found in the booklets here. There are only 8 of them, but you're welcome to take them. And Peter will send us the link to the website as well, so you can see the results for yourself as well.
If you go to that link up there, I'm sorry, I wasn't in the office yesterday. I was going to bring a big pile, but that's all I had. But the final findings are there, this overview, which summarises the 9 group findings. And then there are 9 separate papers on migrants, universal credit, low parents, etc. My students quite like them because it summarises stuff quite succinctly. So by all means, please use them.
Thank you. So this is certainly something we can use in our teaching session as well. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for having me.
So just to conclude, and before we start, the next lecture is on the 28th of November in this very lecture theatre. And it will be given by Professor David White of University of Liverpool, and it will be on the Catalonian rebellions and alternatives to capitalism. So please feel free to come to that as well. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.